Hello. I'm not going to do a crazy beginning like a time where my lights weren't on all the way. Okay, it looks like the audio's working. So, what I wanted to do this live stream for, I'm going to be out of town on the Rhine cruise with Catholic Answers from September 2nd. And then the cruise ends on the 15th or 14th, maybe. But then I'm going to be giving a couple talks in Germany right after that. I should probably tell you where those talks are going to be, but I don't have that immediately in front of me. So, yes, if you are someone who lives in Germany or lives near Germany and you want to go, maybe drop a message in the comments, not in the chat, but in the comments, and I can let you know when I when I figure out what the actual details are. But anyway, I mentioned this because there were some leftover questions from last time that I didn't get a chance to get to, and I felt guilty making people wait like 1, 2, 3, 4 weeks to get their question answered. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to try to answer questions, certainly the leftover questions. If you ask a question by super chat, particularly if you wait a while to do it, there's going to be a chance you don't get it answered until like 3 or 4 weeks from now. So just know that, right? Yeah, but I'll do this as a normal Monday with super chats and all that. So if you want to ask a question, please just send a super chat and I will try to get to it in order. Naaman Menendez says, would you consider piracy to be a sin? Yes, I think especially because I'm going to be on a cruise and I'm going to be going down the Rhine River. I do not want pirates. I assume you mean digital piracy, though. So I hope you'll forgive my not particularly funny joke that I am not sorry for. You know which pirate had something important to tell us? Sinbad. Was he a pirate? Maybe he wasn't even a pirate. But sin is bad. Anyway, piracy gets really tricky because it's multi-layered. But as a general rule, I think, yes, it probably is sinful. The reason it gets tricky is because it's not as straightforward as just taking a thing that somebody else owns and doesn't belong to you. You have situations where, for instance, there's a digital object that is not available for purchase. And in those cases, if the creator's not losing out on any gains, because so let's back up. One of the reasons piracy can be sinful is because the rights holder, who has a moral right to profit from their goods and services, is denied that because people are just taking it. That's immoral, right? Like if I write a book and you take that book, that's not good. The thing that makes it more complicated. Oh, she said I may have answered some of these questions. So if I answered that before, go nuts. I mean, people ask about piracy a fair amount. I think a lot of you are people who are young and don't have a lot of money, but are good at finding things on the internet. It was the other thing that makes it more complicated. Sometimes you're engaged with what is technically piracy, but you don't even know it. Like sometimes I'll read a book online and it's not 100% clear that, but the question there, like I'm not trying to search out something where I'm like, I want to download this thing that doesn't belong to me, but some stuff is freely available online intentionally. So this comes up for me with books a lot. You can find online libraries. These are perfectly moral. And actually, I think a great public service. Open Library, Archive, Internet Archive, like these have big public libraries that you can check books out on digitally. Libby, if you don't have that app, it's great. You can link it to your library card. You can get ebooks and audiobooks for free, and you're renting. And it's no more immoral than going to the library is immoral. And the answer is it's not. You're at least, not per se. If you're looking at something you shouldn't be, that's a different question. That's not the question before us. But libraries are good and online libraries are good. Sometimes it's not clear whether something is a legitimate online library or a pirate site disguised as an online library. And that can be a little more complicated. Also making this more complicated is there's this question with fair use and legitimate criticism. This is a legal and a moral category, frankly. Like when I quote from a book, that's morally acceptable. Like if I quote from a book and say this is a really great quote from C.S. Lewis, or this is a bad quote from somebody, it's not immoral to do that. I mean, the biblical authors will quote other people and then respond. They'll quote sayings of Greek poets, St. Paul will, that sort of thing. That's not piracy, obviously, but there can be this question of how much you can quote. This comes up a lot with music. Like if I want to play a little clip from a song, either as a joke or to respond to the lyrics or just because it sounds nice, is that piracy or not? And this gets into a really complicated question. So I think out and out just taking something doesn't belong to you, those cases, I think you're doing something morally wrong. But I think there are plenty of other cases where it is much, much murkier what the law or morality is around it. I had someone who thought that like I was stealing just by quoting, like doing clips where I quote from Protestants, and they thought it was against YouTube's terms and services, which it's not. It's not at all. And I actually think that is an act, hopefully, of charity. Like when I respond to somebody, I try to clip them, not to humiliate them, but to give them a chance to speak for themselves, because I've watched other people not do that. And I find it unpersuasive when they just say, oh, people on the other side sometimes say X, Y, Z. Maybe they do, or maybe you guys just tell yourself they do. I'd be more convinced if I saw somebody actually doing that. So that's kind of the thought. Winston von Toast also says, related to the piracy debate, digital preservation is really important, especially when companies don't care, e.g. the EU hearing on stop destroying video games. Yes. So in these cases, my inclination is to say that there's not a sin involved at all. Like if you have these massive rights holders who don't care, and if you can enjoy their product that costs them nothing, and the creator at least gets to have somebody enjoying the product, because oftentimes the right holder is not the creator. And if it was the creator, they'd probably care, but because they're the rights holder, they've got too many things that they're worried about. And speaking as an author, I mean, this is purely personal. If the choice is somebody reads my stuff and doesn't pay for it, or they don't read it, 100% I'd prefer they read it. Now, obviously it's great if they pay for it, but I don't want someone to not read it because they can't afford it. Like that's not good. That's not why anybody writes, I hope. I mean, I guess some people it is why some people are professional authors. Okay. Corrected. All right. Ben Thorpe, aka Abel, says, hey Joe, I recently interacted with William Albrecht and mentioned my opinion that the church teaches limited biblical inerrancy, and then you put Dei Verbum in parentheses. William quoted late 19th and early 20th century papal statements which seemed to teach total inerrancy and said limited inerrancy was heretical. Thoughts? So there is more work that I think needs to be done about what we are particularly saying in terms of the error-free nature of biblical text. Let me show you why. This is in Humani Generis, I believe. Let me see if I can find it. Okay, yes. For some go so far as to pervert the sense of the Vatican Council's definition that God is the author of Holy Scripture. They mean Vatican I there, or he means Vatican I there. And they put forward again the opinion already often condemned, which asserts that immunity from error extends only to those parts of the Bible that treat of God or moral or religious matters. So they say they even wrongly speak of a human sense of the Scriptures beneath which a divine sense, which they say is the only infallible meaning, lies hidden. So that is rejected by Pius XII pretty explicitly there, but he also is very clear it's been rejected repeatedly. So you don't want to have I know that is the way a lot of people read Dei Verbum, and in the past I even thought Dei Verbum was teaching something like that, but I don't think that's correct because of passages like that from Humani Generis. But this leaves a big unanswered question of, okay, well, if it's not that, what is protected from error? Because you can have all of these incidental things that don't seem like they make a big difference in terms of the morality or the inspiration of the text. For instance, can you have a historical figure's name mistranslated or misspelled? Or can you have, like, for example, in 1 Corinthians 1, St. Paul says, I am thankful that I baptized none of you except Crispus and Gaius, lest anyone should say that you're baptized in my name. But then he realized that he actually did baptize someone besides Crispus and Gaius. So then he adds in the next line, I did baptize also the household of Stephanus. Beyond that, I do not know whether I baptized anyone else. So that appears to be an error on a more just an error of fact, not an error of, he's not getting moral teaching wrong, not getting theology wrong, but he started to say he'd only baptized 2 people in Corinth. Then he realized that's not true. He also baptized this other family. And then he sort of checks himself and is like, well, maybe this is somebody else as well. I don't remember. So whatever model of inspiration we have, it has to be able to explain things like that. So my fear is that I see a lot of people who take the total inerrancy position, and they take a certain model of total inerrancy, whether they realize it or not, because if you followed any of these debates within Protestantism, you'll know even among people who believe in total inerrancy, some believe in something like a dictation theory of inerrancy, and a lot don't. Like, you can believe that all of this is true while still preserving the fact there's authentic human authorship, that Paul sounds like Paul and John sounds like John, and all of that, that it is done by God in such a way that he has engineered it to be without error, but has still allowed it to, he's freely cooperated with humans. So how do we make sense of all of that? I think more work needs to be done on that for people who want to defend a strong version of inerrancy, like to just say, hey, you can't believe in partial inerrancy, you have to believe in full inerrancy, and not to do the hard work of saying, what about these apparent contradictions or apparent mistakes or these things that seem to challenge total inerrancy, I think leaves the job half done. So that's what I would say to that. Like, I think that the kind of super limited biblical inerrancy that a lot of people, I think, misread Dei Verbum to say is wrong. I think we can talk about the point of inerrancy is to protect faith and morals. I don't think that's wrong to say. But if you said, and all of the historical facts are wrong or whatever, that'd be goofy. That'd be wrong. Nice. Philip says, yeah, so I became Catholic a year ago. This is part of my journey. I realized that we treated the Bible as if it was dictated. But that clearly doesn't work. Right, because in the case of 1 Corinthians 1, this is my go-to example. It's not like the Holy Spirit forgot who Paul did and didn't baptize in the city of Corinth. So a dictation theory, any theory, even whatever your theory of where the Bible comes from entails, you have to be able to square things like that, where internal to the Bible, we can see those kinds of moments, or we can see these questions about dating or these questions about whatever, and say, okay, does this model of inerrancy account for this evidence or not? And to just say, like, mine is a grander theory. I think, because you could say, I think there's no errors in history at all. All history writings are preserved by God from error. That would be a bigger claim about God. The problem is that would be an obviously false claim about God. So we're talking about Scripture. The idea isn't just to get like the biggest claim you can think of, how total can we get the inerrancy, but one that squares with the biblical evidence. And so I'd like to see more on this, is what I would say as my own position. I would like to see a statement that isn't just, here are these church documents that say we need bigger inerrancy. You can find those. It's definitely true. And you definitely have people who have this very minimalist view of inerrancy that ends up treating Scripture as basically inspired in name only. But yeah, I think there's more work to be done. It's SKI, but I figured I'd do the I like the I in ski. Says, does the Eastern Orthodox Church have any scriptural basis for why they shouldn't believe in the papacy? No. Read Pope Peter. I mean, seriously, like the biblical case clearly shows Peter has a special authority amongst the 12. There is no pentarchy. There is no patriarch. There's no, and Peter is clearly more than first among equals. He has authority that the others don't have. And the way he's described in Scripture points to this. In Acts, the 12 are referred to as Peter and the 11, right? Like, this is telling us something. His authority, James Jordan, who is Protestant, points out that when Peter and John go to the tomb and John waits outside and Peter goes in, this looks like the liturgy for the high priest entering the temple, which is, if that's what's going on, that's really cool. I don't know if that's the proper read or not, but that Peter seems to be in this kind of high priestly role. He seems to be in this role like Eliakim or Eliakim in Isaiah 22. Like there are all of these things that point to Peter having a greater authority, like a high priest compared to a priest. That so I think the Orthodox arguments, well, frequently the Orthodox arguments aren't actually from Scripture. And if they are, they're basically the standard issue Protestant arguments, like, oh, if Peter's the head, why does James have an important role at the Council of Jerusalem? It's like, well, he's the Bishop of Jerusalem. Peter put him there. And this is a Council of Jerusalem. So of course he does. Also, a council isn't just a place where everyone sits in a room and listens to the Pope talk. So like the Council of Jerusalem no more disproves the papacy than the Council of Trent disproves the papacy. It doesn't make sense to say, oh, you had a council, therefore you must not believe in a pope. Vatican I, talking about the papacy. Well, it's a council doing it. Does that mean that disproves the papacy? No. So yeah, I've seen some Eastern Orthodox arguments against the Pope, but most of them are historical, not actually biblical. And the biblical ones are just what you basically get from a Protestant, in my experience. Maybe there's some stronger argument out there I just haven't noticed. But Anthony says, what is your study routine? How do you balance reading Scripture, Catholic doctrine, broader literature, and academia? What do you recommend for someone who is studying to enter online apologetics? Okay. There's a difference between when you first begin and when you're going, because a lot of times my study habits now are dictated by what I'm working on or replying to. And so that's going to color a lot. So I've got my own personal prayer and reading and all of that. And I'm a big fan of the second reading from Office of Readings. So even if you don't do the full Office of Readings, if you do morning prayer, evening prayer, and then at least that one reading from Office of Readings, that's a really good, you have some anchor points in your day. And that can be hard. Like as a dad of little kids, that can be hard to do. I did it this morning. I did the reading from Office of Readings and morning prayer at like 6 something. And there was a beautiful thunderstorm this morning, just tons of lightning. It was amazing. I love giant storms in the middle of the night. So getting to do Office of Readings while it was still dark and stormy was really pleasant. Had I waited an hour, it would have been a real mess because the kids were up and it was chaos and, all that. So yeah, get your anchor points, get your daily prayer life and prayer routine and a little bit of spiritual reading for yourself built into your day. And then now that I'm in the midst of it, it's often like whatever that day or the next or the week or, whatever I'm working on holds. So this morning, I was giving a reflection on, so we do like a weekly in-house kind of Catholic Answers reflection thing. So I did mine on this relatively newly canonized saint, St. Raphael Arnaiz Barón, who is a Spanish Trappist oblate who died in 1938, has a really cool story. And Bishop Eric Varden has a good thing on him in one of his books. And his feast day is today on the Trappist calendar. So I wanted to give a reflection on him. So I did some reading on him and, kind of got that ready for this morning. And then I've got 2 episodes I'm trying to record this week because I'm going to be gone for the next few weeks. So that's going to be a lot of the workload in terms of watching videos and reading and everything else. So, and those are going to be for like a few weeks from now, but I'm trying to, so whatever the next kind of project is, that's often what I'm reading on and working on. And in my own case, I'm blessed in that this is my full-time job. Like you guys really do make that possible, where I'm not just trying to do this after work or something. This is my job. It's also tremendously enriching for me spiritually and intellectually, and hopefully it is for you as well. Like I regularly encounter these really cool nuggets that I can't even make videos about, where I just say like, oh, this would be great to talk about sometime. And 5% of them ever come out. So I get to grow from all of that, which is beautiful. As you're starting out though, like, so that's all what I just described is kind of once you're in the swing of things. And know that once you start to get in the swing of things, if you have a weekly, like I've got a weekly research intensive format. Not everybody does that. Some people just like opine on the news or something like that. That doesn't take any real prep. You can just see a news story, give a half-formed take, and people eat that up, whatever. I try not to do that. I try to do stuff where I'm actually trying to watch and internalize and listen to other people's stuff, and then give things I've read or watched that will be helpful and maybe steering the conversation in a good direction. And that takes hours of work to do well frequently. Even a relatively short video might take, all day or multiple days to kind of put together. But if you're just starting off, I've started that sentence like 4 times. Puer Jesus by St. Thomas Aquinas is where I always go. If you want to find, I'm going to drop it in the chat. Don't read it yet, but open it up so you can read it afterwards. St. Thomas Aquinas says, for a man to grow in wisdom, 4 things are necessary, namely that he should listen willingly, seek diligently, respond prudently, and meditate attentively. And that's how you do it. That's the key to the whole thing. That Jesus, when he is in the temple, he's not doing a podcast. He's not doing a live stream. He is listening to the experts of his day, and he's not unquestionably just like taking in whatever they say. He's asking them questions and he's pushing back, but he's in a posture of a listener. And St. Thomas's point is that before you're ready to speak, you need to spend a lot of time listening. And Thomas himself was known as the dumb ox because he was a good listener, because he wasn't voicing his own opinion and answering every question in seminary. He was taking all of this to heart. So yeah. Oh, good gravy. Gray just gave a $100 super chat. I've never seen that before. I will definitely respond to yours. I've got a few. You know what? I've never seen anyone do that. I'm gonna let him cut. Also, it's a good question. He says, hey, Joe, as a Catholic in the military, how do I remain faithful in service to both the nation and the church, especially when they're both at odds or the institution I'm a part of is committing unjust acts? Does there come a point where I must attempt to separate? Yes. This is a great question. And Archbishop Berlioz, the Archbishop of Military Services, I assume you know that, had a good reflection on it. Where he talked about it being morally acceptable to disobey unjust orders. And now, in the context, that was when Trump was perhaps seriously, perhaps not seriously, talking about invading Greenland. And so he made clear that he couldn't see any circumstances under which that would be a just war. And where did he... says, I'm obviously worried because you guys, could be put in a situation where they're being ordered to do something which is morally questionable. It would be very difficult for a soldier or a Marine or a sailor by himself to disobey an order such as that. But strictly speaking, he or she, within the realm of their own conscience, it would be morally acceptable to disobey that order. But that's perhaps putting that individual in an untenable situation, and that's my concern. So that's the reality. You may not do something immoral, even if your boss tells you to, and that doesn't change whether your boss is a corrupt CEO or the commander-in-chief of the largest army in the world. It is a good and noble thing to be a soldier. It is a good and noble thing to defend your country. It's a good and noble thing to serve your country. And it is morally unacceptable to do something you know to be evil in that role. And so if it comes down to that, where you are asked to do something unjust and immoral, you have to say no. You cannot act against conscience. To act against conscience is always a sin. And I know that's a very hard thing to hear, but that is in fact the case. Now, the good thing is that there are limitations of what you have to do. Let me find it here. When it comes to just war, where is it? I think it's Bellarmine. Yes. Okay. Give me a moment. I'm going to find. I have this in an old text message from January 19th. I see it in my old text messages. So rather than finding this quote on the internet, I'm going through old text because I was asked a similar question to this. But give me a second because this was a lively group chat. So I've made it back to January 30th. I got to make it back to January 19th. All right. Indeed, it must be observed that the cause for war must not be trivial or dubious, but important and certain, lest such war bring more harm than the hoped for advantage. If in fact it is dubious, we must distinguish between prince and soldiers. The prince without a doubt commits a sin, for war is an act of punitive justice, and it is unjust to punish anybody for a reason not yet proved. Soldiers, however, do not commit a sin unless it is clear that the war is certainly unlawful. For subjects must obey their superior and must not discuss his commands. Rather, they must presume that their prince has a just cause unless they clearly know the contrary. So you're in a different position than the commander-in-chief is in. He is in a position where if he announces a just war or a war even that could be defended, but which he knows is being done for unjust motives, that's always sinful. But you are aware as a soldier that there are some things that you don't know, and that it is possible that a war which may be dubious is in fact just for reasons that are not fully disclosed. There is a good argument that morally you ought to disclose those to the public, particularly in a democracy. But even if that doesn't happen, if you find yourself in a position where you say, I don't know if this is a just war or not, that, at least according to Bellarmine's view, gives you permission to still obey in terms of going to the war. So if there's two levels. There's whether to go to war and then conduct within the war. Something like Greenland, Archbishop Berlioz says, and I think rightly, there's not even a plausible way. That's not even dubious. It's just like clearly an unjust war. And to cooperate in that would be immoral. Something like Iran, it's maybe trickier because if you believe they were an imminent threat, etc., if you think that's a serious case, and you can in good conscience say this is dubious, I don't know, but there's at least a good grounds for saying this might be a just war, you are not the one who has to make the final call on that. You can't act in a clearly unjust war, but you can act in a dubiously just war. And the example I'd give is this: like if somebody, like let's say you are the night watchman at a building, and somebody says, "Hey, I left my purse in the lobby. Can you give it to me?" And they tell you their name and it matches with the name on the ID. And you're like, I'm not actually, this might be a trick. Like this, they might be pretending to be that person. You don't have to be completely certain. You have enough grounds on that to give them the wallet or the purse. If it turns out later they were lying, that's them, not you. That'll be morally responsible. But on the other hand, if you know someone that says like, yeah, it's like a big gruff guy saying, I'm Betty, this 90-year-old grandma on that license, that's totally me. But it's not. So then to give them the purse would be cooperating in their theft. So you as someone who doesn't have the full facts have a diminished responsibility, but you don't have zero responsibility. That's for going to war. When it comes to conduct within the war, you can't do anything like targeting civilians, committing war crimes, all of that stuff. And the Catechism has a good section on that. If you find yourself in a situation where an illegitimate action is being ordered of you, you're morally required, both under international law and more importantly under the law of the church, to refuse that order and take whatever consequences may come. That's a hard teaching, but God bless you for being in that situation and for being willing to do that for your country. Okay. The Spanish influenza says, how can and should we engage with biblical critical scholarship without seriously endangering our faith? Just ignoring it has been bothersome for me. Yeah, I think biblical critical scholarship is helpful, but honestly a little overblown. Meaning, when you compare it to like just secular scholarship on non-biblical topics, I often find critical scholarship is not as good as its secular counterparts. Like it's people trying to employ secular methodology for the reading of the Bible, but in this way that I get what they're doing, but I don't actually think that many of the big names are all that great at it. If you want a good treatment of that, I mean, one obvious place would be Ratzinger's Jesus of Nazareth trilogy. You see him critically employing and engaged with and criticizing historical critical scholarship in a way that is smart and nuanced, and not just unthinkingly accepting it or unthinkingly rejecting it. Another good one is the introductory portions to John Bergsma and Brant Petree's book, A Catholic Introduction to the Bible, their volume on the Old Testament, which is the only one that's out yet. They have a good chunk in there, I don't know, maybe 40 pages or something, where they go through kind of the history of different schools of scholarship, and you sort of get a sense of both what the advantages are and what the limitations are. Because frequently the problem isn't their data collection. I think the data collection is often fantastic. So I'll say this, my own view. Historical critical scholars are often very good at collecting data. Like they'll say, oh, look, here's this Near Eastern thing that looks kind of like something that happens in Israel. And it's like, okay, that is actually really interesting. That's a really cool connection. I would have never known that. Like, I didn't know the Sumerians did this, or the Babylonians did that, or the Egyptians did this. Or it'll be something on like the history of morphology or grammar or something like this, where you're like, no one knows. Who knew this? And that stuff can be very helpful. The problem is it's embedded within an interpretive framework. And the interpretive framework is often wrong, or at least colored by their own biases and prejudices, which are often in the direction of liberal Protestantism or outright irreligion. And so that's one of the things Bergman and Petrie point out, is that a lot of the narrative of like, oh, the early Christianity was really simple and then it developed into this complicated thing. He's not actually that well supported by the historical evidence. It's imposed on the historical evidence by scholars who are committed to something like an evolutionary principle of going from simple to complex. The reality is often more complicated. This is leading people to say, oh, maybe Paul didn't write Paul and all that. I'll give you an example. So I just gave a talk at Benedictine College on the Jewish roots of Christ as King. And this idea that when we say Christ is King, today, some people use it online as like an anti-Semitic dog whistle or whatever. But actually, the proper understanding is, yeah, Christ is King. And this is reflected not only in Christian thought, but is even anticipated in like Rosh Hashanah Jewish liturgy, and kind of the meaning of what it means for God to be King and what it means for his Messiah to be King. So that was what the talk was about. But along the way, I found some pretty cool research on sacral king liturgies, that in the cultures surrounding Israel, you would have on the New Year the enthronement of the king as God, or the king acting as God, etc. And so Rosh Hashanah, you won't find that Rosh Hashanah just means head of the year, means New Year's. But there was clearly, we see in the Bible that there was some kind of feast on what became Jewish New Year's. But we're not told anything about that feast other than that it has the blowing of trumpets. But scholars have speculated that it was some kind of sacral king type thing of saying that, the Lord is king, and that some of the Psalms and everything else kind of match up with this, that there's a sort of ritual enthronement at the top of the year. And I think there's an interesting dimension to that. But then there's this interpretive question, because you could read that in any number of other ways. One is Israel is just copying pagan culture. Two is that the king of Israel is presenting himself as a God king, which I don't think we actually have good evidence for that within any of the Jewish liturgy, but that people are assuming sometimes that happened, that, oh, the king must have been doing something like what the Babylonian king would do. Or three, this is basically your Jewish repudiation of the surrounding pagan cultures, that they have this thing where they start the year saying the king is God. And we have this thing at the beginning of the year that says God is king. And it's a great rejection of the kind of false view that the king is God. So, yeah, I that's what I would say. Like, I wouldn't just, again, I wouldn't blindly accept or blindly reject biblical critical scholarship. And just know a lot of, like, one thing, final thought on this. A lot of the critical scholarship that you get now contradicts the critical scholarship from 20 years ago, which contradicts the scholarship from 40 years ago, which contradicts scholarship from 60 years ago. And I think critical scholars would tell you, like, oh yeah, this is a young field. It's still, growing and evolving. And, the consensus one day may be overthrown by another scholar a generation from now and all that. So you should hold on to any historical critical conclusions very lightly, because they're not very sure. Even if they talk in these very bombastic, we've absolutely got it figured out this time kind of ways, they've changed their story enough times that that we should be cautious. Okay. Oh, okay. So I see Logan Leroy's question. I know I answered. Beatrix's question, Paul, a New Covenant Jew, I know I answered. I think I've answered. Oh, okay. I think the only one I haven't answered from the prior stream is the one and only says, as a recent Catholic convert, how should I understand Vatican II's teaching that Muslims should be esteemed? Is that not contradictory and false? No, esteeming people for attempting to worship God is not bad. So let me find the language here. Nosfertate says the Catholic Church rejects nothing of what is true and holy in these religions. No, let's start with that, because I think that's an important point. When we talk about, you know what, I'm just going to start here. One of the things that I think makes Trent Horn have one of the best podcasts around, and something I probably should imitate, but I don't, is he regularly focuses on areas that Catholics and Protestants actually agree. Like when he talks about culture war stuff and all that stuff, I know some people roll their eyes, and some people are like, why are you doing this? But he is, I think, very strategic and very intentional about this. He does a lot of things that Catholics and Protestants can agree on in answering atheism and secularists and perverts and all that. And then when he talks about things that are areas of disagreement between Catholics and Protestants, he's built up a reservoir of goodwill. I often focus on the disagreements. Now, I hope it's clear from watching this that I have a great deal of love and respect for the Protestants I'm interacting with, that it's not coming out of a place of vitriol or hatred. But I'll tell you, some people have read it that way, and I understand why, because I'm focused on the disagreement. And part of that's just the nature. I do one episode a week. So if I, tried to balance it out, like if I was in person, if it was me and a Protestant in person, I would not spend my entire time saying, here are areas we disagree, because that'd be unhealthy. Imagine if you were in a relationship and you said, here's some things I don't like about you. Here's some things I think you could do better. That would not be a healthy or probably very lengthy relationship. So there is a need to focus on what the other person does well, what they get right, even, and maybe especially, if you want them to change. I try to do that a little bit within each episode, that even if I'm criticizing, I try to say, here's where we agree, here's where we disagree. Sometimes I do it, sometimes I don't do it. Sometimes I just kind of forget to do it completely. And I often pay for it if I don't do it, because people are much quicker to say, oh, you're lying, you're disingenuous, you're dishonest, or whatever else. If you're somebody who's nodding in agreement with Trent 80% of the time, you're probably not going to assume he's suddenly switched into liar, awful mode the other 20% of the time, if you have any emotional or intellectual maturity whatsoever. But if you're seeing someone who is regularly critical, it's easier to just write them off as a hater, write them off as whatever. So I give all that to say Vatican II's approach is to say, where do we agree and then where do we disagree? And some people do that to a fault, where they only focus on the areas of agreement and they kind of exaggerate the agreement. And that's kind of the thing often associated with a certain kind of boomer Catholicism, that I think people roll their eyes at ecumenism and all of that, and certainly interreligious dialogue is like, well, we're worshiping the true God, you're worshiping demons, but at least we're both worshiping. It becomes kind of ridiculous. But in a world that is fiercely anti-religious at times, where you have this rise of atheism, secularism, and the like, even people worshiping a false god, in a weird way, are closer to us than someone who just doesn't care about the question. Like someone who is like, I care deeply about uncovering the spiritual dimension of reality and making sense of my existence, my being here on earth, the cosmos, and all of that. Even if they've gotten every answer wrong, they're trying to have that conversation. And we can applaud the fact they're trying to have that conversation and then have that conversation with them. Whereas somebody who just says, like, religion is the opiate of the masses, we don't need to worry about any of this stuff, or they just kind of roll their eyes, even if they say, oh yeah, totally, I'm Christian, but I don't care. Like, I don't want to oppose my religion. I don't want to think too much about it, etc. The person who is a devotee of a false religion is probably the person you're going to have a more meaningful and constructive conversation with to lead them to God. So Vatican II has a particular theology, which I completely agree with, that God has revealed himself in many and various ways, not only by the prophets, but even by natural law, in such a way that people exercising what Aquinas calls the virtue of religion, even though they've got wrong conclusions mixed into their theology, are exercising an actual virtue of trying to find God. And that what is needed is not just an outright repudiation of their false religion. What's needed is the separation of the true elements and the false elements, because God has led them to whatever elements are true, and then their own human error and everything else has corrupted that with what is false, their own sin, ignorance, and so on. So the Catholic Church rejects nothing of what is true and holy in these religions, Nostra Aetate says. She has a high regard for the manner of life and conduct, the precepts and doctrines, which, although different in many ways from her own teaching, nevertheless often reflect a ray of that truth which enlightens all men. Yet she proclaims, and is in duty bound to proclaim without fail, Christ, who is the way, the truth, and the life. In him, in whom God reconciled all things to himself, men find the fullness of their religious life. So Jesus isn't just like the preferential way. He's not just one way among many. He is the way. And yet, nevertheless, we can recognize that he has prepared people in some ways for the gospel. So then, when it talks about the church's high regard for the Muslims, one of the things recognized is they worship God, who is one, living and subsistent, merciful and almighty, the creator of heaven and earth. But if you notice the source there, it's not some crazy modern source. This is a letter sent by Gregory VII in the 11th century to Al-Nazar, the king of Mauritania. And it should say Saint Gregory VII. So this is, a very holy, saintly 11th century pope who is recognizing that Muslims get a lot of theology wrong, but they're right that the God of Abraham is the one God, and that this is a God worthy of worship. And like, this is something we can affirm with them. So it's about finding legitimate areas. You don't want to exaggerate the common ground, but find the legitimate areas where our disagreement isn't so big. And you can actually start to have a constructive conversation about the areas where we do disagree. I hope that makes sense. I know that troubles a lot of people. We're not saying their worship is just as good as Christian worship, or they're already where they ought to be, or anything like that. We are simply saying, when we say something like Islam is false, we don't mean all of Islam is false. Because when they say the God of Abraham is God, we'd say, yeah, no, that's actually true. Or when they say we should serve God, we would say, yeah, we should. Like, these are areas of common ground. So let's own the parts where we agree. All right. Nathaniel Frecco says, explain magnanimity and humility. Magnanimity is being great-souled. This magna, great, anima, soul, so great-souledness. And it's desiring great things. And people sometimes mistake that as a vice. That if I want to be great, that therefore I'm proud, and that's bad. Now, in fairness to them, the pagan understanding of magnanimity was about pride. Pride was viewed as a virtue. But the Christian understanding is, no, you should want the greatest thing, but the greatest thing is sanctity. The greatest thing is being a saint. And you should want to be the greatest saint you can possibly be. So I like to point out that at the Last Supper, when the apostles are debating which of them is the greatest, they're not sinning. And Jesus doesn't tell them that they shouldn't want to be great. They might be prideful in thinking they already are the greatest. They're not prideful in wanting to be the greatest. So if you think you are the best, that might be a reflection of ego. Wanting to be the best is a desire for excellence. And a desire for excellence is good. You should, like, if you want something less than that, if you are a Catholic content creator, you should want to be the best one out there. You should want to be better than me. You should want to be better than Trent. You should want to be better than everybody out there. Not out of vainglory, not out of pride, but out of a desire to do the thing God has called you to do well. And if you want something less than that, I don't think you want enough. And if all of us want that for ourselves and for the other person, like all of us should want not only our own excellence, but our neighbor's excellence as well. This is one of the things that's going to differentiate this desire for greatness from pride. So the ultimate expression of magnanimity is actually like the martyr, the person who gives up their life. They give up everything for something greater. So that's authentic magnanimity. Let's talk about authentic humility. It's not humble to pretend to be less than you are. That is a false humility. That's actually a vice. That's evil. So if God has given you 5 talents and you bury 4 of them so that you can be equal to your neighbor who has 1 talent, you have done an enormous disservice to God, because God has given you more and he wants more from you. And you've also done a disservice to yourself, because you're going to be judged more harshly. To whom much is given, much will be expected. To whom more is given, more will be expected. Luke 12:48. So it's not prideful to, number 1, recognize you've been given more talents than your neighbor has, if that is in fact the case. And number 2, to act like it. You should. An archangel shouldn't act like an angel. A cherub shouldn't act like an angel. They're higher. They're called to more, and they know it, and they are expected to. So if you have been given more, act like it. So when do they cross the line into pridefulness? Well, when it becomes, remember, pride is essentially a competitive vice where you want to tear down the other person. This is the tricky part, because you want to be great, but you also want your neighbor to be great. If you want to be great by bringing your neighbor down, that's pride. That's not magnanimity. And that's where it can be kind of tricky, because I just said I want people to want to be better than I am, but you should also want me to be better than I am. That's kind of the double-edged sword, because you want to see in the other person. There can be sort of a fun competitiveness, but not the prideful competitiveness. So Basil and Gregory on the feast day, I never remember if it's Basil talking about Gregory or vice versa. I'm going to find out. St. Gregory, on the death of Basil, talked about himself. He said, talked about Basil and Gregory together. Gregory is talking about Basil. There we go. He says, our single object and ambition was virtue and a life of hope in the blessings that are to come. We wanted to withdraw from this world before we departed from it. With this end in view, we ordered our lives and all our actions. We followed the guidance of God's law and spurred each other on to virtue. If it is not boastful to say, we found in each other a standard and rule for discerning right from wrong. Like, that's the idea. Strive for greatness and help your brother strive for greatness. Whereas like pride is about tearing the other person down so you can feel better about yourself. And also, like, if I have 5 talents and I act as if I made myself those 5 talents, that's prideful. That pride is it's the downward look rather than the upward look of gratitude to God. If you're thankful for the things God has given you, that's not pride, because you realize you didn't deserve any of it and that you're going to be judged for how you use it. So there's a certain humility in recognizing God has given you things to use and you've got to go do it now. All right. Champagne Future says, why is the Christian apologist and interdenominational debate world so small, considering how many people have relevant academic degrees? It's a good question. I think a lot of people, well, it's a different thing to know theology from being able to be an apologist, from being able to be a debater. Those are all different skill sets. Like, I've known many people who have degrees in theology, but they don't have the on-the-spot retention that would be necessary to do some of this. Now, they could still do pre-recorded episodes, but some of them also don't know how to present things in a way that's lively. And I think if you go digging, you'll find plenty of people who've made like a handful of videos, but they often come off as like stuffy and academic, or they don't really know how to interact with the camera and with the crowd. And so there is a lot of untapped potential. I think there's a tremendous growth opportunity in the world of Catholicism for just more voices. No, already I have trouble keeping up with, like, I don't watch all of the good Catholic content. There's more stuff. People are like, you got to watch this video. Somebody did, it's really good. I mean, I raved about Ethan Muse's debate. He's already had another debate. Like, that's insane. It takes me like months to prepare for a debate. Well, I mean, not really. Yeah, kind of. I do like a couple debates a year. And he did 2 in like 8 days. It's bananas. I haven't even had time to watch the second debate. So there's a high ceiling. I also would say, yeah, as I say, the academic degrees can be very helpful, but by themselves, that's not going to be enough to be an effective apologist or an effective debater. Other skills are needed as well. Maybe that's enough to say there. But I do think that there's a lot more people who could get into this space and would be great. I actually think we need some people who aren't just trained theologians, because I think one of the biggest areas that's untapped is just living out the Catholic thing, by which I mean a lot of people become Catholic not because they were convinced by a certain logical argument, but because they saw it lived well. And seeing it lived well was persuasive. Think about Tom Brady's diet. Like Tom Brady has this banana diet. It's like TB15. I don't mean that you eat bananas. I actually don't know if you're allowed to eat bananas on this diet. He has some crazy diet. Now, one way you could convince somebody else to do that diet would be like, yeah, here's all the science behind why the nutrition works and all of that. And some people, that's what they need. They need to see that. That's going to be the thing that persuades them. Other people just need to see Tom Brady and be like, okay, that guy was like kind of in shape when he joined the NFL. Then he got super fit, super in shape. And if he tells me this is the way he did it, and I want to be like that, I'm going to go do that. Well, similarly with the saints, you look at the saints and maybe you're convinced by the theology and you can understand how they got there. Or maybe just look at the lives of the saints and you're like, that checks out. Those people are living much holier lives than I'm living. I'm going to try it their way because trying it my way hasn't gotten me the results I want. So I think what the world of Catholic apologetics needs is not just more people like me or like Trent or like anybody like that. I think more would be great there. I think we need people who are doing something radically different that goes hand in glove, which is just living out the Catholic life. And I think that's going to be one of the keys, because one of the things that I've noticed, and you've probably noticed it as well, there's a real gender disparity. Apologetics channels are about 75 to 80, 85% male. And that's pretty much across the board. Elizabeth, Biblical Bookworm, did some work where she talked to different content creators, got some of the behind the scenes numbers, and it tracks pretty reliably. Like right now, there's like 223 people on here. Maybe 30 of you are women. That's not entirely surprising because this way of thinking about problems, of solving them in a kind of analytical fashion, tends to skew more male. There are women who think this way as well, obviously, but it's much more of a male way of thinking. Whereas the experiential, let's see this thing in action, how does this get lived out? That is often a way women respond to better. I mean, how many times have you seen the back and forth where somebody will quote a stat online, and then you see someone else respond and be like, well, not in my experience. In my experience is blah, blah, blah. And then the first person is just like, yeah, your experience doesn't matter. You're one person. This is a data set of like 2,000 people. But there is nevertheless a legitimate need to see this stuff actually lived out on paper. So I think, in other words, humans are wired differently. There's a bit of a gender skew to that, but it's also just some of it's just personality. So you might be on either side of that. So seeing more people going the experiential route, not in a way that's like unacademic or stupid, but in a way that just shows the thing lived out. I think that will appeal to not just a broader audience, but a different audience. That might help offset that disparity somewhat. We'll see. Titan Jake says, who is your favorite saint outside of Mama Mary? I'm inclined to say St. Francis de Sales, because he's been so influential for me spiritually. And if you watch my episode tomorrow, you'll see I've responded to some of Redeem Zimmer's attacks on him with Braden Cook. So keep an eye out for that. I'm looking forward to that. Hopefully it's a good, respectful. We recorded it before his recent, I don't want to say crash out, his recent reassessment where he's decided to become more anti-Catholic because he's been burned by Catholics being mean to him, which, first of all, don't be mean to him. Second of all, that's not a valid reason to turn against Catholicism. Like, those two things can both be true. And third, when you start going after doctors of the church who are famously charitable, it's not as strong. It doesn't look good. All right. Let's see. Speaking of Redeem Zoomer, Bane of Logical Fallacy says, have you watched Redeem Zimmer's response to the Ethan and Sean debate? What are your thoughts? What are your criticisms? What are your takeaways? I have not. I saw that he made a response. I saw some of the ways he carried himself in the comments. I saw that it got taken down and then got put up on Ethan's channel, or no, sorry, Sean's channel, excuse me. But I didn't actually watch the thing itself, so I'm not going to comment on it because I haven't seen it. Amend says, Noah's Horrors and Chad's in the house. Holla. Joshua says, thoughts on how to talk to a conservative Baptist pastor who rejects the idea of any use of Old Testament prefigurements like Passover for the Eucharist to understand New Testament doctrine. I would just say that he's being unbiblical in that. Like that is not a rational position for a Christian to hold. And I would point him to 1 Corinthians 5. I do that all the time. No, wait. Was I right the first time? No, it was 1 Corinthians 5. That was right the second time. 1 Corinthians 5:7, St. Paul says, cleanse out the old leaven that you may be a new lump, as you really are unleavened, for Christ, our paschal lamb, has been sacrificed. So we are told explicitly in Scripture that the sacrifice of Christ is a paschal or Passover sacrifice. So if I want to understand the sacrifice, I need to understand the Passover. And that's what we mean, because the Passover, you killed the lamb and ate the lamb. We would say this makes sense of Good Friday and the Mass. Good Friday and the Eucharist, Good Friday and Holy Thursday. Like these two things go together if you have a biblical read of the sacrifice according to St. Paul in 1 Corinthians 15. 1 Corinthians 5, I did it again. Why do I do that? I don't know. It's a very weird tick. 1 Corinthians 10, to understand baptism in the Eucharist, Paul points us to the parting of the Red Sea and the eating of the manna, and he uses this in a way that's obviously prefiguring baptism in the Eucharist, and then in the next chapter he talks about the Eucharist. To just refuse to allow any of that evidence is to insist on reading the Bible in an unbiblical way. So that's what I would stress. Like, this is not how the New Testament reads the Old Testament. So if you say we have to apply your man-made restrictions on what we're allowed to learn from the Old Testament, show me in the older New Testament where it says that's how I'm supposed to read Scripture, because I can show you where it's not. So I would just have the debate about that. Now, it's fine to say that the literal sense grounds the other senses. The Catechism says as much. And that we shouldn't just take these like purely spiritual takes that were kind of like dehistoricizes everything. That's true. But seeing a connection between the two testaments is very important for making sense of Christianity and why we're not just Marcionites. Like, we don't just throw out the Old Testament. We believe Christ is hidden in the Old Testament and revealed in the New. Learning Bizcath says, how would you respond to other communions having incorrupt bodies of the saints? I'm not actually familiar with. I mean, there might be some Orthodox. I don't know if there are. So I will proceed on the assumption that such people do exist. It's not incompatible with anything Catholic. I just don't know any of the fact. I don't know of any particular incorruptibles who aren't Catholic. We would say that they were saved. Like, we recognize that the means of salvation, although incomplete, lie within those communions. So there's a couple things. Number one, not every purported incorruptible is in fact an incorruptible, just like not every miracle that is purported is a real miracle. Sometimes it's just slow decomposition, or it's a certain kind of ossification of the body. I don't know if this was pretty early on in Shameless Popery. I did a deep dive on incorruptibles when I went to see a reported incorruptible saint. She isn't been declared a saint or anything like that. But in Gower, Missouri, the woman who founded the community, when they dug up her body, she appeared to be incorrupt. So I took a video of it, and I did a weird amount of research on decomposition of bodies, and I was half expecting to get a knock at my door at 11 at night from the police, wondering what in the world I'm doing. But fortunately, or maybe unfortunately, maybe I'm alarmed that didn't happen. Nobody tracked me down. Anyway, sometimes, like, we have to be clear, because if you have like a sealed, like let's say you bury someone and it's perfectly preserved, there's no air, that gets in, then their bodies will stay incorrupt looking, in some cases much longer. Or you can have a situation where they're based on the climactic conditions, etc. So some of the people may not be actually incorrupt, and that's on both the Catholic and the Orthodox side. That's something we have to discern carefully, not just at a popular level. But even still, the fact that somebody might be incorrupt is pointing to the fact that they're saved, that they're holy, and prefigures the resurrection of the body. Like, we allow the Eastern Catholic churches to celebrate saints on their calendar who were saints during a time where their communions were not in full communion with the church. They weren't themselves schismatics. They weren't people who chosen to break away from the true church, but they were living in this state of imperfect communion because of somebody else's decision. That doesn't immediately send them to hell, especially when being in full communion would have been basically impossible wherever they were in the world at that time. Like we kind of take it for granted. You can become Catholic or Orthodox or whatever because you're living in the modern world in the West. But if you're living in, like St. Gregory of Narek, Armenia, in a time when it's not in full communion with the church, you didn't choose that. You're not perpetuating that. You're not defending that. That's just like the only church you've ever seen is not in full communion. That's not a schism. Like, you're not a schismatic, I should say. That is, you're experiencing the fruit of a schism, but you're not yourself a schismatic. Schism is not an inherited sin. Like, if you live in country X, that whole country goes into schism from the church, and then you are raised, live and die in that church without ever even being exposed to the broader church outside of your country, you are not guilty of the sin of schism, according to the church. And particularly in a case where the sacramental means are all present and all of that, you remain oriented in a certain sacramental way towards the one true church. And so this should all be understood in a nuanced way, because someone who is an active schismatic, the sacraments don't do them any good because they're still damned by virtue of their unrepentant schism. But for someone who's not guilty of that sin, those same sacraments can avail them of eternal life. So all that's a very long way of saying it's not shocking if there are incorrupt saints who are in, like, the Orthodox Church. I'm just not familiar with any. Angel, or Angel, says, "Hi, Joe. How would you respond to the common Protestant phrase, Christianity is a relationship, not a religion, usually followed by them citing Matthew 7? Yes. So I actually talk about this a little bit in my book, The Eucharist is Really Jesus, and point out that what they're trying to get is that Christianity is not just a rule code, because that's what they imagine. Like, they imagine religion equals just some kind of code for do this, don't do that. Now, that is a bad understanding of religion. It's not a biblical understanding of religion. James 1:27 says, religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this, to visit orphans and widows in their affliction and to keep oneself unstained from the world. So religion involves a dual relationship, your relationship with God, but also your relationship with your neighbor. That's going to have a lot of do this, don't do that to it. So you should do orphan visiting, widow visiting, keeping yourself unstained from the world. You should don't stain yourself, like, there are do's and don'ts to this. But morality is rooted in relationship. So the rules make sense only in virtue of a relationship. So if you're married or even dating, there are rules. You might, like, the first time you date someone, frequently will be the case that you discover there's some things you didn't know you weren't supposed to do. And then you do them, and then it causes a problem, and you're like, oh, I guess I wasn't supposed to do that. Or there were things you were supposed to do, and you didn't know you were supposed to do them, and you learn it the hard way. That's okay. You should find out what the rules of your relationship are, because you and the other person will be happier if that is the case. So healthy relationships have rules. I think the modern tendency towards these vague, undefined relationships is terribly unhealthy, even in human affairs, and is much more unhealthy in our affairs with God. So God gives us structured relationships, that is, relationships with rules. And the technical term for this is a covenant. So there is a giving of God to us and of us to God, but in an orderly sort of way where there's expectations built in. And so the height of this is in the institution of the Eucharist at the Last Supper. The only time Jesus ever mentions the new covenant is at the Last Supper with the Eucharist, that we receive his body and blood. That this is a very deep communion. That is as deep of a relationship as you're going to get. That someone who says it's a relationship, not a religion, it may be thinking about God, maybe talking to him, but we actually receive him bodily. We get something better. We get something deeper at a relational level. So that's at the heart of it. Like, it's good to want the relationship, but the relationship needs to have rules, and the term for this is covenant. And so if your idea of religion is just moralistic codes, you're right, there's something much deeper. The moral codes are rooted in something deeper, in a covenant, in a relationship, in our communion with God and in our communion with our neighbor. Speaking of the Eucharist, Jess, who I think may have said, it says Jess loves Luke. I don't know if that's Jess or Luke talking. Or maybe it's some third person who's just observing that their friend Jess loves their friend Luke. That's really nice either way. Well, whoever you are, I believe you said in a follow-up that you were a Protestant looking at Catholicism, and this is a great question. It says, what is the best New Testament support for the Eucharist being propitiatory in nature? See, a lot of arguments for why Hebrews doesn't condemn the concept of representation, but how is it upheld? Like, why is it kind of a positive view? And the idea that is that simply, number one, the Eucharist is not a separate sacrifice from the sacrifice of Christ on the cross. It is a participation in the sacrifice, and Paul teaches this explicitly in the Bible. And number two, the sacrifice of Christ on the cross is propitiatory. This is also taught explicitly in the Bible. So if those two things are true, then the Eucharist is propitiatory. If it's a sharing in the propitiatory sacrifice of Christ, then the Eucharist is true, and the Eucharist is propitiatory. I mean, all right. Wait, are the people fighting? Oh no, don't fight. Hello to everyone in the chat. I'm sorry. Wait, Ethan Muse is in the house. Hey, Ethan, congrats. I've been really impressed with you. All right. I was starting to talk about the Eucharist as propitiatory. Now, just so you know, I did a debate with James White on this. So if you want a much longer conversation on this, I think you can just look up. It was on the channel Apologetic Dog. So you could find Apologetic Dog. It is, go to their videos, go to popular. No, did they take it down? What? Nope. Okay, scratch all that. Heschmeyer White debate. Oh, no, I think it was, because it was streamed. I hate the way YouTube does that, where videos and lives and all that. Look up these words. Heschmeyer White debate. And it's called Roman Catholic Mass Debate, Dr. James White versus Joe Heschmeyer. And it's an hour and 44 minutes long, but we get much more in the weeds. But I'll give you the short version. As I said, number one, the Eucharist is a true sharing in the sacrifice of Christ. It's not a separate sacrifice. It is the sacrifice of Christ. And the model here, as I said before, is the Passover. 1 Corinthians 5, Christ, our Paschal Lamb, has been sacrificed. If you want to understand the sacrifice of Christ, understand the Passover sacrifice. The Passover sacrifice has the killing of the lamb, but then to participate in it, you, presumably you didn't personally kill the lamb, you participate in it by eating the lamb. I always give the example if you're like a Jewish teenager. So under the Mosaic law, you were not required to even own the lamb. So some families, some families would be too poor to own a lamb, or their house would be too small to eat an entire lamb. So Exodus 12 verse 4 says, if the household is too small for a lamb, then a man and his neighbor next to his house shall take according to the number of persons. According to what each can eat, you shall make your count for the lamb. So notice it's really critical in choosing a lamb for sacrifice that you have to be able to eat the lamb, because that is a required dimension to the sacrifice. And this is the sacrifice Paul tells us to look at if we want to understand Christ's sacrifice. It's a sacrifice where it's not enough that the lamb be killed. The lamb has to be eaten. So if you're a Jewish teenager, you don't own the lamb, your family doesn't own the lamb, you didn't raise the lamb, you didn't tend the lamb, you didn't pay for the lamb, your neighbors own it. They give it to the priest in the temple kills the lamb. How do you participate in the sacrifice? Now, sure, your dad's going to smear the blood on the doorpost. That's really good. But how do you share in the Passover sacrifice? What is your active participation in the sacrifice? Well, The act of participation in the sacrifice is eating the lamb. And St. Paul is going to apply this to make sense of the Eucharist. He says in 1 Corinthians 10, I speak as to sensible men. Judge for yourself what I say. The cup of blessing which we bless, is it not a participation in the blood of Christ? The bread which we break, is it not a participation in the body of Christ? So he's just said, somehow, in the Eucharist, we actually participate in the body and blood of Christ. Then he says, because there's one bread, we who are many are one body, for we all partake of the one bread. That the one Eucharist makes us a church. Why is this? He then says in the next verse, consider the practice of Israel. Are not those who eat the sacrifices partners in the altar? That's the key. That we, whoever participates in the Eucharistic sacrifice, is a partner in that sacrifice. So that's what it means to be a partner in the altar. Now, that is a propitiatory sacrifice. So the Mass isn't a second propitiatory sacrifice. It is the one sacrifice. So more nuanced. It is a separate action within the one sacrifice. Just like in the old days, the Passover had these very distinct acts. You would kill the lamb. You would smear the blood of the lamb on the doorpost. You'd eat the lamb. You would actually, even before that, you have an offertory where you dedicated the lamb. All of those things are separate actions, but they're all one sacrifice. They're not four different sacrifices. So modern readers often imagine sacrifice is just killing the animal, and that's wrong. That's not how Jewish sacrifice worked, and that's not how pagan sacrifice worked. That there were certain sacrifices, and the Passover is one we care about here, where to participate in it, you had to eat the sacrifice, and you were actually forbidden from leaving leftovers. That's why you had to choose a lamb that was the right size for your house, or join in with somebody else, so that there wouldn't be a risk of leaving any leftovers for morning, because any leftovers for morning had to be burned because you weren't supposed to have done that. So that's the shortish answer. And if you want more on that, you can see my debate with Dr. James White. Xenomorph Warrior. Oh, thank you for doing that. We need more people fighting off the xenomorphs. Said, I struggled to teach on the death penalty. The state doesn't wield the sword in vain. Prisoners are regularly victimized by other prisoners, from forced sodomy to outright murder, as well as Giovanni Battista Bugatti. Yeah, I think there are legitimate points to be made there. Bugatti was the executioner for the Papal States. So there's different interpretations. One view says the death penalty was always wrong. It's always and everywhere evil. I think that interpretation is hard to square with Catholic teaching historically, and certainly Catholic practice historically. I think the better interpretation is that the death penalty, because it has a dimension that simply is an affront to human dignity, it may not be the only affront. Like imprisonment may also be something of an affront to human dignity at times. We don't need to deny that, but if the death penalty is an affront to human dignity, if there's something that is in tension with human dignity in it, and we no longer need it practically, then it stands to reason that we can push for it being outlawed. This is, I think, the position that St. John Paul II, articulated pretty clearly, and less clearly Pope Francis, but that seems to be the better interpretation of Pope Francis's words. He said things that seem like they could be read in either way. I think it's better to read him in that second way. So yeah, I think this is an issue where it's not something taught at the highest level of authority. It's not something where it's an infallible teaching. And I'd love to see greater clarity around this. I know Pope Leo just reiterated a call to push for the death penalty around the world, but just someone doing the work to explain, here's our theories of appropriate retributive justice and everything else, and here's how to square all of that. And unfortunately, we've been slow in doing some of that. So, all right. Oh, apparently Gavin and Cameron Bertuzzi are going at it right now. Dang. 22 Space Saint says, how to understand martyrs in defense of chastity, since both City of God and Supplementum Tertia Part says, sexual assault doesn't affect the victim's purity. Yeah. So are you thinking of people like St. Maria Goretti? The the argument here, let's get both these things. So these are both really important. If you are the victim of violence, that has not impacted your virginity. You remain a virgin in the sense relative to God and relative to anyone who is moderately holy. You're not guilty of any sin or crime or affront to your purity and dignity. So that's number one. This is clearly taught by St. Augustine, St. Thomas Aquinas, and should just be, in a sense, kind of common sense. There are, nevertheless, those who died fighting or like resisting attacks out of a, not just a natural human desire for self-preservation, but seemingly a particular desire, a certain kind of honor for the body as a gift from God, motivated them in their fight against assailants. And so the tricky thing is, how do we honor that, which is good, being willing to die rather than consent to this thing that you don't consent to. How do we honor that without seemingly demonizing people who did not successfully fend off attacks, etc.? And that can be very tricky to do well. And I think this is one of those things where maybe there can be at times some tone deafness on the part of especially Catholic men who maybe aren't aware of an unintended message being sent there. But I really don't think it's a message that is being intended. I don't think anyone's trying to say like other victims. Oh yeah, that palm in the back that stays green all year round might be fake. Other victims, we're not saying other victims are bad. That was a terrible time to interrupt myself. Sorry. So yeah, we can honor that one of their motives was defending their virginity and purity without also believing that their virginity would have been taken away. The hardest thing to talk about in any way that I really don't know if I should even talk about this on a live stream, because there can be a real danger here, is that there can be situations that someone is seduced into sin and then becomes cooperative in the sin because of an internal act of consent. And hear me out here. Being a victim, not a sin. Being a victim and even having bodily pleasure at the time can be really emotionally messy. Like it can mess you up a lot emotionally. Still not a sin. So maybe we just leave it at that. Because this is a tricky topic to handle in a good and careful way. Oh, okay. There's a good follow-up to the earlier thing about I'm the easiest person to derail. But actually that time the streams crashed for a second because I mentioned Muslims. I don't know. But this is a follow-up to a thing I answered earlier. So I wanted to answer this. I think it's necessary to explain well. Heavy Bar says, hey, Joe, how do we harmonize 1 John 2:23, which says, no one who denies the Son has a father, Lumen Gentium, which says that Muslims worship the one true God? Because saying they worship the one true God doesn't mean they have the Father in the sense relevant to 1 John 2. That these things, it's a misreading of the verse to read that. You cannot know about the Father, or you cannot know about the Son. You can not be a Trinitarian and still have some relationship to God and still worship the one true God. St. Paul in Acts 17 talks about pagans who have like a monument or an altar to the unknown God, and he explicitly talks about how they worship this God. Now, they were not Trinitarians, and they had things that were inconsistent with Trinitarian theology, but it's a relatively low bar to worship the one true God. That's not like, let's be very clear. To worship God is not enough to be saved. Like, you can be unsaved and still offer worship to God. It can be false worship. It can be worship corrupted by sin, etc. More is needed. But it is something. It is a place of some common ground we can build from. All right. Alexander says, what is the symbolism of werewolves? You got me there. I don't know, because I'm not aware of werewolves having any symbolism. So, okay, let me see if I remember this right. Silver bullets, is that vampires or werewolves or both? There often is deeper kind of spiritual significance to the way, like, stories, like certainly vampires have a heavy Catholic sub theme. I don't know enough about the history of werewolves to know. I think those are probably just born out of people's fear of wolves, but maybe there's more. Oh yeah, vampires have wooden stake, but I thought it was silver bullets also. Is it not? So in the movie Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter, it argues there that silver bullets work against werewolves because of the silver from Judas's betrayal of Christ having been turned against the demonic. And I think that's a cool interpretation. I don't think that is the original interpretation. It seems like it's a very modern detail that they can be killed, like werewolves can be killed by silver bullets, and then I think that was extended to be applied to vampires as well. But as kind of retconning it, that is pretty clever storytelling. That there is a weirdly religious scene in Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter. I watched it when it first came out as a joke. I don't remember it nearly well enough to give an endorsement. It might be, I think it's like a PG-13. I don't think there's anything totally over the top in it. But I remember just being really struck that they got this Catholic symbolism right, of recognizing this is a kind of a mockery of the Eucharist, and that the forces of good are the forces of Catholicism, where like the blood of Christ compared to these blood-sucking monsters, and then the silver of Judas being turned against him with Christ vanquishing the power of the devil. It's just it's great. All right. Simeon Robin says, Casti Canubi, paragraph 27, tells wives to follow reasonable orders. So does Colossians 3:18. Please detail husbandly authority. You never do. Asking in good faith, unwed. Well, because I think that is not a good way of framing it. Like this, I'm not punting on the question to say, if your understanding of marriage is that you're going to have a certain set of orders you make to your wife that she's going to have to follow, you're setting yourself up for a miserable marriage. Like, yes, wives should be subject to their husbands as is fitting in the Lord. That is true. But if your imagination of that is in the series of you giving orders and your wife following those orders, that's not good leadership. That's just not what good leadership looks like across the board. You can say that's weak or whatever. You're just wrong. Like, I am in a position to lead not only in my family, but in other contexts as well. Like, I work with Mike. He's my producer. There are times where I have to give instructions and all of that, but it goes so much better if you don't imagine it as like, I get to bark orders and other people have to receive my orders. That is just not how good leadership looks. And so this is one area where I think a lot of the people asking this just need to see effective leadership in practice to be like, how do good leaders lead? And then do that. That's the first thing. So I think the question is misframed, and it's not a punt. That's just me saying, like, I think you are fundamentally getting this wrong. But nevertheless, let's talk through Casti Canubi 27. I love Casti Canubi 27. I love all of Casti. I mean, my wife and I, we read Casti Canubi in preparation for marriage. Quotes St. Paul, let women be subject to their husbands as to the Lord, because the husband is the head of the wife and Christ is the head of the church. And then says, this subjection, however, does not deny or take away the liberty which fully belongs to the woman, both in view of her dignity as a human person and in view of her most noble office of wife and mother and companion. Okay? So we are not taking away that dignity. Now, I've seen people try to downplay that and say, like the Tim Gordon, Joe Enders live stream, where they claimed I didn't respond to Chastity Can Be 27, which I read in its fullness. And then they sort of downplay it. And that's not good. Like, read Chastity Can Be 27, read John Paul II stuff on women. Like, the magisterium does not stop with Chastity Can. Chastity Can is part of the magisterial teaching of the church, but there's a whole theology of the body that John Paul II lays out on relations between men and women. And if you want to understand this fully, don't just proof text your favorite document, actually read it in the tradition. And it's so much more beautiful and rich in that context. Like, don't do to church documents what fundamentalists do to Bible verses, right? Like, read them in context, read them in the tradition, and read them through the magisterial authority of the church. Okay, that's the first caveat that is given in Chastity Can Be 27 by Pius. Nor, he says, does it bid her obey her husband's every request, if not in harmony with right reason or with the dignity due to wife. So, just as earlier, I don't know if you were around when we were talking about soldiers might be in a situation where they have to refuse unjust orders. No one is permitted to act against conscience. No one is permitted to act against conscience. If you're asked to do something that you cannot in good conscience do, you may not do it. Now, as a person who is not in the top position, there may be times where you're asked to do something you don't have the full story on. And there may be times you're asked to do something that isn't the discernment you would have come to. So I'll give you an example. You work at a company and your boss says, we're going to do this strategy. That's not the strategy you would do, but you go along with it because you work for that company and you're going to submit to the authority of your boss. That's not acting against conscience. I want to be very clear. When we talk about acting against conscience, we mean something more direct. It would be sinful for you to go along with it. But that can come up in marriage. And it can come up in marriage where two people have discerned in opposite ways. So this can come up very clearly in something like raising children, where the husband says, I want you to do this. I want this kind of thing. And the wife is not just like, that's not how I would do it. But no, there's a much deeper issue. Like, it would be wrong to do this to our children. Like, this is actually harsh to a point where this is offensive to their dignity, and I can't in good conscience go along with it. That's the kind of thing where it can kind of come out, where that's not about usurping. That's about a Catholic refusing to do something that would be immoral. Like, if you're at work and there's a homeless guy sleeping outside and your manager says, I want you to go and push him off the bench he's sleeping on and then like kick him and scare him away. You're going to say like, no, I'm not going to do that. Like, even though I work for you, I'm not usurping. I'm just refusing to cooperate with evil, because that is a bad way to treat another human being. So similarly, if you're a wife and your husband has like a bad way of parenting, where it's not just like, I disagree, we've got different schools of thought, gentle parenting, blah, blah, blah. No. Like, if they're doing something that would be actually sinful, or wanting you to do something that'd be actually sinful for you to do, you may not do it. This is Catholic teaching on conscience. This is not some newfangled thing. You can find conservatively 800 years of stuff going back to Thomas Aquinas and Peter Lombard on the right of conscience. You may never act against conscience. If you believe it would be sinful to do a thing, it is always and everywhere sinful for you to do that thing. Even if the person who tells you to do it didn't sin in their own discernment, because maybe you have some insight they don't have. You're not saying they sinned. Maybe they are not sinning, but you would be sinning to cooperate, then you cannot do it. So if it's contrary to right reason or to the dignity due to a wife, if it is degrading to you to give in to your husband's demand, whatever, then obviously don't do it. But then there's a third exception. Nor, and fine, does it imply that the wife should be put on a level with those persons who in law are called minors, to whom it is not customary to allow free exercise of their rights on account of their lack of mature judgment or of their ignorance of human affairs. And I pointed this out in my response to Tim and Joe, but they treat women like idiots on their streams, and they refer to them as like teenagers. And Pius says the exact opposite. He says, no, they're not. They're not like minors. And somebody said, oh, well, minors in canon law was like under 12 or something. It's like, no, it's not. Under 18. Like, a teenager is a minor canonically. Don't treat women like children. That's insulting, and they're not. And instead, you should treat them as collaborators. This is your spouse. You're not marrying your oldest child, right? This is not just one more child put in your care. This is someone to rule with you. Like, the wife as helpmate is cooperating with you. And so if you don't have that view, get a better wife, honestly. I mean, you're unwed, so I can say that. Like, marry someone you actually respect, and you'll be doing a lot better. All right. So that's the first half. I'm just going in the order paragraph 27 is presented, and you'll notice he gives a bunch of important caveats, which are often downplayed or omitted. But then he says, but it forbids, meaning Paul's teaching, forbids that exaggerated liberty, which cares not for the good of the family. It forbids that in this body, which is the family, the heart should be separated from the head to the great detriment of the whole body and the proximate danger of ruin. So you have this other thing, which is clearly contrary to Catholic teaching, clearly contrary to Paul's teaching, clearly contrary to the nature of submission, where the wife's just kind of doing her own thing. Well, my career, it's better for me to do this, better for me to do that. And so she's just got her own separate mission over here. That submission, even if you think about sub under mission, like you're under the mission of your husband, you're on the same plan together. It doesn't mean you're just unthinkingly a yes man, but it does mean that you're pulling in the same direction. So if you're a wife who's on a different mission, you've got your own like career goals and all of that that are to the detriment of your family, and you're just like, well, I'm going to do what I want to do, you do what you're going to do. You're on separate missions, and that's the thing that he calls detrimental, because the head and the heart are separate from each other. That's bad for you, bad for your spouse, bad for the family. So that's the kind of thing that, like, I think his teaching on submission is quite clear. He's not saying you must follow orders. That's because that's just not a good way of understanding submission. That's not a good way of understanding any of that. No, it's true. Like if there's a situation where it's like, okay, we've talked this all through, and there's a prudential thing that has to happen here, and the husband says this is how it's going to have to be, because there are times where you do have to just say, this is what it's going to have to look like, and we have to figure out something. You've got some situation, maybe it's, your kids are small, and at what point do you put them in their own room? Do you get up with them? Do you move them into the bed? Do you do all that stuff? Like those kind of questions, very practically, you have to be on the same page about that stuff, because if one of you is like, bring the child into the bed, and one of you is not, and then the child's brought into the bed, that can be a real source of marital frustration. Or you have plenty of other things like that they're not the end of the world. They're clearly issues of prudential judgment, but they're ones on which you guys should talk it over. But the husband is responsible for making some kind of decision after consulting with his wife, and the wife is expected to go along with it, even if it's not the decision she would make. Now, a smart husband, that's not going to be many issues that are like that. It's much more going to be, let's get on the same page and move forward. That's going to be healthier for everyone involved. And by the way, that'll mean you get better results, because someone who's voluntarily cooperating with a plan does a lot better than someone who is going along under force of, docility or submission or something. So hopefully, Simeon, that gives you a better sense. But yeah, I think the reason, like, if you're just expecting there's going to be a manual that says, here's how all this goes, marriage is a relationship, and relationships don't usually look like that. All right. Raphael says, hey, Joe, I live in Switzerland. Where and when will your last talk be on the cruise? So I'm actually going to be speaking at, the cruise ends in Basel, but okay. I don't know if I have all of that information in front of me. You know what, Raphael, do me a favor. Drop a comment in the comments below, because I'm going to have to do a little digging to find all of it. It's weird. It's not in a easy to find place, but the reality is I don't know where I would even find that information right now. Yeah, I'll have to text somebody about that. All right. Brian says, if transubstantiation changes substance but not accidents, what do we call the moment of transformation when the accidents visibly change? Eucharistic miracles. Yeah, I think we'd call that a Eucharistic miracle. I mean, I don't know of another term for it, because there's just a miraculous transformation, but an external miraculous transformation. Matrix says, Paul, a New Covenant Jew. Friedrich, at 6:00 this morning, after I finished morning prayer, I went online to get that book to take with me on the trip that I'm coming up on, and I completely blanked on what it was. So Thank you. Yes, I was like, okay. I ended up getting a John Bergsma book, Jesus and the Dead Sea Scrolls, because I couldn't remember what book I was going to get. Well, no great loss. I got another book. It was $2 for the Amazon Kindle version. So FYI, Jesus and the Dead Sea Scrolls is like $2 right now. I don't know why it's so cheap. Yeah, Brian. So let me see I'm going to double check to make sure there's not some way that Thomas describes it, because he has a part on Eucharistic miracles, if memory serves. He just talks about it as miraculous appearance or apparition. That's probably a good term. He says such apparition comes about in two ways: when occasionally in the sacrament, flesh or blood or a child is seen. Sometimes it happens on the part of the beholders. Sometimes it happens. Yeah, okay. So Eucharistic apparition, that's kind of a clever term for it. So if we want to steal that from Thomas, that's a good idea. All right. Womp Womp 11 says, how should I understand Catholic prayers that seem to go beyond intercession, asking Mary / the saints directly for things, i.e. St. Paul, give us deep faith, Mary graciously be my guide and counselor, etc. Well, two things. When you say something like St. Paul, give us deep faith, you mean through the intercession of their prayers. But you can also ask saints to do things, and that's not bad. So one of the oldest Marian prayers that we have, actually maybe the oldest one, depending, we have a piece of Ryland's Papyrus number 470, which has been dated by some dating as early as like the mid 200s. It's not clear if that's correct or not. It's hard to date papyrus. It says, beneath thy compassion, we take refuge with Theotokos. Do not despise our petitions in time of trouble, but rescue us from dangers. Only pure, only blessed one. That sounds much more beyond. But if you ask, well, how does she rescue us from dangers? Well, through the power she's given by God and principally through her prayers. So anytime we're asking the saints for their intercession, we're asking them to act, it is principally in the order of prayer. But also, like, there's nothing idolatrous about asking somebody to help you, even somebody who's in heaven, or like an angel to help you. Like, think about the fact that, I mean, there's already in both the Old and New Testament references, like the angel's not letting you hurt yourself. This is the ridiculous misinterpretation of the text that if you remember in the temptation of Christ, when the devil's like, throw yourself off the temple, because the Psalm says that he's not going to let his angels will keep you from harming yourself. It's like clearly not what that text is about, but there is a sense of angelic agency that angels, like demons, can actually do things. Well, saints can also do things, but the chief way saints and angels help us is through their intercession. Last thing, I think, just to maybe add to this, there are devotional prayers that use very over-the-top kind of sweet language, and I think we just recognize that for what it is. You're saying something very sweet and romantic, almost, not in a weird sense of romantic, but you know what I mean? Like, you're very poetic. Like, oh, you're glorious, you're wonderful, and all this. And taking that in a very cold, dry, analytical way is going to misread the text. It's like surgically trying to understand a joke. You're just going to lose the humor in the process. Or as St. John Henry Newman said, like, don't read a love letter like a police report. Creston says, why are Novus Ordo Eucharistic prayers and offertories so short? They were trying to emphasize the noble simplicity of the Roman Rite, and they were drawing on some early patristic prayers that seemed to be very short. It's not clear in some of those cases whether the prayers themselves were short or whether we just have an abbreviated version of the prayers. Like, so for example, the offertory and the Didache is super short, but maybe there's more to the prayer and it's not trying to write down the whole thing. So I'll give you an example. Now, concerning the Eucharist, thus give thanks. First, concerning the cup, we thank you, our Father, for the holy vine of David, your servant, which you made known to us through Jesus, your servant. To you be the glory forever. And concerning the broken bread, we thank you, our Father, for the life and knowledge which you made known to us through Jesus, your servant. To you be the glory forever. Even as this broken bread was scattered over the hills and was gathered together and became one, so let your church be gathered together from the ends of the earth into your kingdom. For yours is the glory and the power through Jesus Christ forever. That's it. That's the whole offertory right there. I actually think those are totally beautiful. So I think you can have beautiful short prayers. I don't like the idea of doing it short just for the sake of it being short, but I get there's kind of people often want a shorter mass. The other thing, so in the TLM, you have low mass and high mass because you want times where it's like, look, I realistically can't give an hour on a work day in the morning before I go to work, or like an hour and a half for like a beautiful mass. But I still want to worship God, and I would love to be able to receive the Eucharist, and I'd love to be part of like the highest sacrifice. So having a low mass that is still reverent but brief is good. And there's some version of that, I would argue, with Eucharistic prayer 2 and maybe Eucharistic prayer 3, whereas Eucharistic prayer 1 and Eucharistic prayer 4 are much longer. And so I think I've seen some priests do this, where they'll do Eucharistic prayer 3 during the week and then 1 on the weekends to show what's called graduated solemnity, that you've got your normal weekdays and then Sundays are higher, and then like Sundays in like with a solemnity are higher, like Easter and all that is going to be at the very top. So just like you have different altar arrangements with 2, 4, 6 candles, showing the level of solemnity, because if every day is a holiday, then no day is a holiday in a certain sense. So I think there's something to be said for that, but I'm not a liturgist. Amend says, Joe, in your humble opinion, who do you think really wrote the letter to the Hebrews? I don't know. I discounted Pauline authorship for a long time because Paul doesn't sign it, and he does with all of his other letters. But I've seen the argument that, well, that's not shocking, given that he doesn't have the same cred with this Hebrew crowd that he did with like the Gentiles, that he can be like, hey, I'm Paul. And they're like, yeah, it's Paul. Whereas here, if he's like, hey, I'm Paul, they're like, this guy again. And so, maybe that's exaggerated, but there does seem to be some of that. And some of the church fathers point that out. They didn't put it in that cavalier of language, but you get the idea. But the idea that someone in Paul's entourage who's deeply formed with Pauline thought, like a Timothy or somebody, wrote it, that makes a certain sense. It has a unique theological bent, which might be because of the readership. Because this is the only letter in the New Testament that talks about Jesus as the high priest in this very explicit way. But it's also, so if it is Paul, he might just be like, okay, finally, here's a group of people who can understand Old Testament priesthood and how that leads to the New Testament priesthood of Christ. And this would have been largely lost on a lot of his Gentile readers. So maybe that's it. I don't know. It's a great question. Brian says, how could Moses and Elijah appear in their glorified bodies with Christ during the transfiguration? The gates of heaven weren't open until Christ's sacrifice. Yes, this is another good question. As far as I know, it's not explicitly stated anywhere. John Paul II seems to suggest that they went up to experience heaven. Yeah, let's see. So Catechism is 637 says that Christ opened heaven's gates for the just who had gone before him. Well, let me put that in broader context. In his human soul, united to his divine person, the dead Christ went down to the realm of the dead. He opened heaven's gates for the just who had gone down before him. So then, is it the case that Enoch and Elijah were in heaven or not? And there's a general audience that Jim Yakin points out in July 21st, 1999, that says the depiction of heaven as the transcendent dwelling place of the living God is joined with that of the place to which believers through grace can also ascend, as we see in the Old Testament accounts of Enoch and Elijah. So that actually seems to me to be a little underdetermining of the question, because it is, so we know that the word heaven is used in multiple senses. And like when Paul talks about the third heaven in, what is that, 2 Corinthians? 2 Corinthians 12. I know a man in Christ who 14 years ago was caught up to the third heaven. Whether in the body or out of the body, I do not know. God knows. That seems to be a recognition that there is atmospheric heaven, like the sky. Then you've got outer space heaven. Then you've got a heaven beyond, where we talk about the presence of God. But it does seem as well that some part of that third heaven might have not been the experience of the beatific vision prior to Christ opening the gates of heaven in the full sense. But we just don't know. I mean, one thing that should be absolutely clear is that the Old Testament passages about the afterlife are more shadow than light. Like they kind of say, yeah, there's Sheol, there's going to be a rising from the dead. Oh, by the way, there's the heavenly glory and there's damnation, but all that is slowly comes out. And so, St. John Paul II talks about how in biblical language, heaven, when it's joined to earth, indicates part of the universe. So that's going to be the cosmos, not the eternal heaven. Metaphorically speaking, heaven is understood as the dwelling place of God. And then the depiction of heaven as the transcendent dwelling place of God is joined with that of the place to which believers through grace can also ascend. So there was some sense in which Enoch and Elijah ascended to heaven by grace. What that looked like prior to Christ's death, we don't know. And so I think that's, an interesting dimension. All right. Warvan 5227 says, God desires for all to be saved, but not everyone has access to the gospel or are misled. I understand that invincible ignorance and sufficient grace exist, but it seems most people have the faith they're born in. Well, yeah, this is a difficult question. And this is one of those things where God himself will judge that, well, what does it mean for a person who grew up in a religious monoculture to not have challenged that monoculture in ways that maybe they wouldn't have even thought to challenge it? And how are they going to be judged by God? Vatican II deals with this, and it postulates that some of those people, at least, might be saved in ways that are known to God, not because their false religions are true, but because God is the one who's inspiring whatever good is in their religion, and God is speaking to them at the level of their heart through conscience, and God has made himself known through nature. That seems to me to be perfectly biblical and patristic, although it is mysterious. So Justin Martyr can talk about people like Socrates as Christians, which is pretty fascinating. Similarly, Psalm 87, after praising Zion and the city of God, says, among those who know me, I mention Rahab and Babylon. Rahab is a metaphorical way of saying Egypt. Behold, Philistia and Tyre with Ethiopia. This one was born there, they say. And of Zion it shall be said, this one and that one were born in her. For the Most High himself will establish her. The Lord records as he registers the peoples, this one was born there. So all that is to say that Jesus tells us he has faithful who aren't of the flock of Israel. He says that explicitly in John 10. He says, I have other sheep that are not of this fold. I must bring them also, and they will heed my voice. So there shall be one flock, one shepherd. So then the question becomes, okay, so he says that, and certainly one of the things he's doing in creating the church is creating one flock for all of his sheep. But not everyone comes to know the reality of the church right away. So what does that look like in terms of the judgment of those people? There's a difference between someone who has heard the voice of God in the flock that they're in and has tried to respond to it, but hasn't made their way into the one flock of Christ in a full and visible sense because maybe they're not even aware it exists. It's a good, mysterious question. All right. I'm going to do a couple more questions, then I'm going to have to save the rest of these for when I come back from the cruise. Are there any, so Vanessa, I'm going to ask you this. Are there any questions you saw that seemed really urgent? Because if there are, I'm happy to. Dom Wallington had a follow-up question about the death penalty. It said, did you already talk about the death penalty? Yes. People are saying the church changed its stance on this. Depends how it's interpreted. Do you have the history and how it's not changed? So there's we certainly are promoting not killing people with the death penalty, and we used to not only permit it and encourage it, we used to do it. Like papal states had an executioner. So there's certainly a change at least a policy level. But that's not necessarily a contradiction. And John Paul II basically argued modern means of criminal justice and all that rendered the death penalty no longer necessary. And I think that's a perfectly good way of handling it. That death penalty is not intrinsically evil, but it's not a first choice. And if there's a better way of resolving the question that satisfies the demands of justice, we should do that instead. But it's a complicated thing. So I think it takes a more nuanced approach than either the defenders or opponents have really done in a thoughtful and charitable spirit. And so I've been a little disheartened by the way that whole debate has proceeded. And I think more needs to be done. One thing, if you want a good resource on this is an older one, but Cardinal Dulles in First Things has an April 2001 piece called Catholicism and Capital Punishment that I think is very good. All right. Okay. Jalen Barrios says, Joe, first, thank you for everything. Oh, you're welcome for everything. Been aspiring to be a catechist in my local parish. With your experience in faith, how does someone go about teaching the faith to new aspiring converts? Yeah, I think it can be very helpful to find out where they are, because it's very hard when you're first starting off to know what people already know and to kind of meet them where they are. And that can vary wildly based on where you are in the country and where people are in their own background. Like different parts of the country, you've got different education levels, you've got different levels of biblical literacy and awareness. Like you've got some places where the average person going to OCIA has already a pretty good biblical foundation. You got other places where that is just not the case at all. So you're not going to have a one size fits all sort of approach. You can use all the materials and all of that. I think a good thing to do early on. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm thinking OCIA, but as a catechist. Yeah, I mean, you said new aspiring converts, so I'm assuming that's what you mean. But sometimes catechists also deal with existing Catholics. Either way, having something like a Q&A night can be very helpful. And if maybe you're not in a position where you can just answer those kind of questions on the fly, what you can do as well is have like a basket or something where you collect questions and then you can read them and you can prepare answers and you can figure out as well where people are on their journey. You can let them do it anonymously or whatever. That can be very helpful in getting a better sense, because one of the hardest things is giving people what they want and what they need. And so often we're guessing what both of those things are, and we sometimes guess badly. So yeah, there's more that could be said on that. I guess just at a very practical level, don't make it too lectury. Don't jam too much in there. I know it's tempting to be like, I only have this many weeks with them. I want them to get all of this. I always just say, like, I will do my part if you do your part, and your part is reading these parts of the catechism or whatever. You know, like you can make those kind of deals with people, and the ones who do, and the ones who don't, but it's on them if they don't. And then you can ask questions to them. There's different things just pedagogically, like as a teaching method, that can increase how much people take away from it. Like if you ask them questions, if you do things that are more interactive, that can be helpful for retention of information. If I'm sitting passively and someone is speaking unbroken for an hour, I mean, you guys just did it for 2 hours, that is often not a good way to actually retain data. Titan Jake says, Christ gave us 2 swords. Why are we so hesitant to use the second for defending against radical Islam's ruthless attacks? I mean, we do it at a police force level. One of the difficulties is the modern state doesn't know that it is the sword of God, and will even say it's not. So that makes it trickier. More could be said about that, of course. But yeah, the modern conception of the state is not the traditional Christian conception of the state. Brum, bum, bum. All right. I will do 2 more questions here. Actually, 3 more questions because one of them is about a brother-in-law planning to become Catholic. Amend. Well, I'm going to get your question in 3 questions. But as I do that, maybe you can give me more information about your brother-in-law. Like specifically, how old is he? How well-read is he? What kind of stuff is he already? What's his background? All that will be helpful. Okay. Esteem says, hi, Joe. What are your thoughts on allowing other apostolic Christians communion/confession versus stressing obedience to the Pope and full communion? Build from what we've got. So, I think a policy where the church says, I'm happy to defer to the church's Eucharistic communion guidelines, by the way, because the church is the communion, and so makes sense. But the communion is also Christ. So, those 2 things are true. Like the church is formed from the communion we have with Christ. Given that, and given the fact that Jesus is sacramentally present in Orthodox and Coptic churches, I think we can build from that and say, yes, we already have a certain level of Eucharistic communion and that we mutually can recognize Christ's presence sacramentally. Now, they may not actually be ready for that on their end, but we can recognize that. And then we can build, I think, from that. That doesn't get rid of everything, and we don't want to treat the papacy and full communion with the church as an irrelevancy. But if we have enough that the church judges, this is enough to offer communion to them, that seems to drive them towards communion with us. Like if you can receive communion in the Catholic Church and you recognize it's valid as an Eastern Orthodox, I don't think that pushes you away from the Catholic Church or makes you think, oh, well, since I can get communion either place, therefore the church is irrelevant. I think it shows the irrelevance of the schism, that the schism is unnecessary. If you can say these people have the body of Christ, we should be in full communion with one another. And so if anything, it should motivate us towards being fully in communion and resolving the remaining issues. But that may be too Pollyanna-ish of me. I'm sorry, I lost my place. Oh, here it is. Okay, sorry. And D. Hoff said, I don't know the best way to ask. Is there an argument against sola scriptura by going into the history of the 66 book canon? Yes, there is. Absolutely, there is. The canon question. So look. Oh my gosh, Amanda, I wasn't trying to get more money from you. You could have just done that as a regular chat. Sorry. The canon question works like this. So if you say the scripture is the sole infallible rule of faith, it alone has ultimacy and finality, a few things are going to follow from that. First, I know that some modern Protestant apologists try to say you can affirm sola scriptura without doctrinal sufficiency, but that is not historically faithful to Protestantism. Sola scriptura in the Protestant model was the belief that scriptures are sole infallible rule of faith and that all saving doctrine comes from scripture. The problem is the canon, which seems necessary for any saving doctrine. Well, I don't want to say that. That's not quite right. Knowing which books of the Bible, knowing that a book is inspired becomes necessary. So I think an important distinction needs to be made here. The early Christians weren't particularly interested in the question of the canon of Scripture. As weird as that is, even when you have like the disputes with Marcion and people who reject the Old Testament, the church's response is not a single organized, here are the books we all regard as the canon. And so when you have like the First Council of Nicaea, the popular imagination has them figuring out which books are in the Bible because that's what we would expect them to do, but they don't. Like people who say, oh, well, that was just put together by Constantine and the bishops. It's like, no, weirder, it wasn't. That they didn't actually settle the question of which books were in the Bible. They had a rough idea, but they differed on some of them. And they didn't think those differences were particularly important as long as they didn't lead you to false conclusions. So maybe you had a couple books I don't have, or maybe I had a couple books you don't have. Maybe I'm missing a few, maybe you've got a few too many. But as long as we agree on the principles of the faith, as long as we agree on the regula fidei, the biblical books are a means towards the end of orthodoxy, not the other way around. Whereas, and I think that's a very important point to stress, modern Sola Scriptura works by saying, here are the books of the Bible and everything has to come from here. So we have a common starting point, but then different faithful Protestants interpret those books differently. And so you get different endpoints. Christianity works, historic Christianity works the exact other way around. You might have different books slightly. So you might have different starting points, but you're all ending up at the same point, the rule of faith, the principles of Orthodox Catholic Christianity. That's crucial to understanding like the early church. So I'm not saying that the canon of Scripture is inherently necessary to figure out. I am saying if you're going to use that Protestant approach of sola scriptura, then you really need to know which books are and aren't in the Bible. So one form of that problem is just all of our knowledge of canonicity, or much of it at least, is extra biblical. There's no book in the Bible that tells us which books belong in the Bible. So you couldn't just pick up a bunch of scrolls and say, I think these 66 are the inspired ones and not these other ones over here. It doesn't work. There's no principled way you're going to get to that. So all of that makes sense just at an abstract level. I think people can understand that. But man, that argument is supercharged by the fact that even if you're going to appeal to tradition and the church, you can't appeal to that if you believe in a 66 book canon. And this is the point I tried to make in one of my responses to Gavin Ortlund. As sometimes happens, that conversation went sideways. But the point I was trying to make was you can't rely on, well, the Holy Spirit led us to get the Bible right, if your position is that the canon the church agreed on was actually wrong. What are you doing there? Because now you can't get the information from Scripture itself, and you can't lean on tradition, and you can't lean on the church because tradition and the church weigh against you. So I think there's a really serious problem in terms of the canon from a sola scriptura perspective. And a lot of the ways that they've tried to resolve it don't make any sense, to put it bluntly. Meaning, and I'm not picking on Gavin here, I'm genuinely like moving on to other. I've seen Protestant apologists who will say, oh, here are these people in the early church who had a short canon. And yeah, that's often true. Now, it's actually more complicated than that for reasons I'm not going to get into, that frequently when they talked about which books are good for proving doctrine, they meant proving doctrine to Jewish people. So you only want to use books that are going to be in the Jewish Bible if that's your goal, which was for many early Christians, the group they were trying to convert. That's just helpful to know that what they mean by ecclesiastical books versus like Jewish scripture or canonical books is different than the way later readers are going to interpret that. That there are books we regard as inspired that they don't. So if you're trying to convince them of the proof of Jesus being the Messiah, you can't be like, but look, it says so in Luke. And you also can't by being like, look at wisdom too. But if you're a Christian, you can absolutely look at those things. So that's one thing. But the second is even the people that had a short canon, it wasn't just the 66 book Protestant Bible. It's more dynamic than that. You might say, well, it's close-ish, etc. But that doesn't really make sense, because if you're starting from the evidence and saying, here's the books they had, you would never get to the 66 book Protestant Bible. So what's really happening here is you've got the conclusion that you want 66 books, and you're saying, well, this guy had 65. That's close enough. Or this guy had 64. But if you're starting with them and just being faithful to the evidence, it would never lead you to 66 books. Like that is, I think, historically just an impossible position. Because you've got Jerome and Rufinus for the first 1,000 years of the church. That's two people. Are there more than that? I mean, you've got some that have similar, but you can't have similar. I mean, remember, the whole dispute between Catholics and Protestants is on 7 books. All right. So, Amend finally says, hey, Joe, my brother-in-law is planning on converting to Catholicism. Give me a list of your books that I should buy him so he can learn more. Wait, a list of I think you just wanted a list of books. I don't know which way to read that. Is this books that I should buy him that are good books? I'll tell you the list of my books, but I think you mean just all good books. He's in his late 30s. He's very curious, but has little to no knowledge of church history, but he wants to learn. Yeah, actually, I will recommend my book. The early church was the Catholic Church, as intended to reach people who might be in that broad category. And there I'm looking at 4 things. the Eucharist, baptism, bishops, and the 4 Gospels. So hopefully that's helpful to him. I really like giving people the book Catholicism by Bishop Robert Barron, because I think it does a good job of just introing people to Catholicism. Trent's book, Why We're Catholic, also. The Belief of Catholics by Monsignor Ronald Knox. It would be good. I know you talked about like church history and all that. Introducing him to some of the spiritual dimension of the church is, man, what a gift. And when people realize this, they often find that really transformative. Father Jacques Philippe has a lot of very good books on spirituality that are nice short books that help people pray. Because that's one of the things. If he's coming into the church, he's going to be learning to pray. And let's see. Francis de Sales' Introduction to the Devout Life. I'm purposely mixing in some apologetic with some spiritual books, etc. Thomas Dubé's book, The Fire Within, on Carmelite spirituality, might be a little too in-depth for him, but that might be a good one to have on backup if he finds the spirituality stuff really good and wants to go deeper on that. I think Frank Sheed is a fantastic writer. His book, To Know Christ Jesus, is a good biography of Jesus. Theology and Sanity would be another good one. Guardini's book, The Lord, I like 90% of that book. There's some parts I don't love, but that's another good one. And he's just a really good writer where it's very spiritually rich. So yeah, I'm purposely doing kind of a mix where it's not just apologetic, let's answer this doctrine. If he's got particular questions, Mary, Eucharist, whatever, that could also be a good thing to know in terms of giving better book suggestions. Okay, one last one. The Hidden Manna by Father James O'Connor. It's basically a series of primary sources where it's just him quoting a bunch of different saints on the Eucharist in order. And so the book's in 3 parts. Part 1 is the patristic period. Part 2 is the Reformation. Part 3 is the modern period. I recommend it just for part 1. It's kind of helpful to realize the different views of the reformers and how they don't line up very well with the early church. And then you get these modern theologians and you just shake your head. But the book kind of gets worse as it goes on because of the people he's having to talk about. But when you get to read the church fathers in their own words on the Eucharist with a little bit of explanation from Father O'Connor, I think that's very helpful. He also gives you different sources and you can then go deeper on those things. So I think that's a good one as well. I haven't read Dominion, but I know Spider-Man wrote a book called Dominion. That joke is going to be lost. Tom Holland wrote a book called Dominion, British author, who I believe is not Christian, but views Christianity as really helpful to the modern world. Is he? I can't tell from his Wikipedia page if he's an atheist or not. But either way, I've heard mostly good but somewhat mixed reviews where he's a non-Christian praising the influence of Christianity. That could be an interesting one just to give kind of an outside perspective on the church. Okay, one more. Its name is right on the tip of my tongue. He was my professor. Thomas Madden, sorry. Professor Thomas Madden has a bunch of good books on church history. And you can get them, at least through the Kansas City Library, in audiobook form where it's just him lecturing, which is super great. So yeah, that's another recommendation. All right. Okay, yeah, I'm sure people in the chat have other book recommendations. And so I've got a brilliant idea to very subtly boost the signal here. Because here's the thing. As a YouTuber, the more comments and likes and everything else you leave, the more people end up seeing the thing and then clicking on it and hopefully changes their life. It's a great free way to help spread this. And here's the way you can do it while getting to plug books that you like. In the comments, I invite everyone watching this right now to just comment one book that you think someone coming into the church should read. Ideally, a book that that hasn't already been mentioned. All right. God bless you all. And I will see you guys in a few weeks now. Peace.